I was recently asked if I could do a woodworking demonstration table at a Autumn Fest taking place in my city later on this year. So I'm going to start off, this is a demonstration of different kinds of joinery is what I'm going to do for the table. Starting off, I'm going to mill down some scrap boards I had laying around the shop. I'm going to mill them into 6-inch long by 3-inch wide sections, which should give me enough to demonstrate different kinds of joinery and let people see what they look like. So in this video, I'll be demonstrating a number of different joinery techniques that I use. I'm also going to finish them, sand them, and get them ready for display. Some of the joints will be glued together and some of them will be loose so that people can take them apart, such as the mortise and tenon, and see how those joints actually work to hold the wood together. In addition to this, for the display, I'm going to have some pieces of wood sanded down to different grits, and I'm going to have a couple different finishes on some other scraps of wood so people can see what different finishes look like when you're done. If you find this video in any way helpful or entertaining, please subscribe to my channel for more to come. And please let me know in the comments below what joint you tend to use the most in your workshop with what you make. After I rip all my boards down to 3-inch wide sections, it's time to swap out blades. I was using a Euro-style ripping blade from Amana, and I'm going to switch over to a combination blade to do all my cross cuts so I can get all those cuts down into 6-inch sections. If you're curious about that blade storage I pulled out, I'll put a link in the top right corner if you want to check that out, how I made that. After everything's cut to its final dimensions, I go ahead and sand everything down on both surfaces to 150 grit. That way it's going to be much easier to do now before things are assembled with some of the joints. The first joint I'll be making is a box joint. Now I have this table saw sled that I used for cutting my box joints. If you want to see how to make a sled like this, I'll link the video in the top right corner. You can go check that out. I have a full build on how to do this. Next, I'm going to cut a half lap, and the easiest way I found to do this, because you're trying to take half the thickness off of each of the two pieces, is to use a set of calipers to determine the thickness. And once you get that number, you cut it in half, and then you can set the blade height just below half so you can sneak up on the exact thickness you need. Then I use a marking knife to mark off how far across the board I want to go to make those joints. Clamping a stop block in place allows me to get two identically wide cuts across the two pieces of wood. Now I go back and forth to make sure until I get that appropriate depth and just kind of sneak up on it with the blade height. I don't want to go all the way across the wood until I know exactly what height I need those pieces to be cut to. Next, I'm going to lay out my mortises for my mortise and tenon joint, and I'm still pretty new at this, but the key with the mortiser, I have a hollow chisel mortiser, which I'll link in a video above for that video on my mortiser. But the key is to find the center point, because you want your mortises centered on your piece, make it much easier, and I still haven't quite got that down. That's going to take some practice on my part, but I use a marking gauge to help mark the center. I set it on the ruler and then mark the center of the edge of my piece where I want my mortise to go. I also use the marking gauge to mark the upper and lower limits of where I want that mortise to be, because I don't want it to be wider than the board that the tenon is going to be cut into, of course. You want the shoulders to cover up the entire mortise, so I use the marking gauge for one end of that and then readjust it to mark the other end where I want that mortise to stop. Over at the mortiser, you'll see I'm working with walnut now. I'm cutting 2 of each of these because the walnut will be loose and the poplar will be glued together so that people can see the strength of the joint. When I was cutting the poplar, I actually clogged up the auger bit full of poplar. I had the auger bit set a little bit too close to the chisel itself, so it didn't leave enough room for the chips to clear out. So that took me a little bit to get cleared out, and I adjusted accordingly. But now I'm cutting the walnut, so I'll have 2 of those joints. The stop block I'm placing right now is going to mark the depth of the tenon itself, and I'm going to sneak up on the 4 sides, use the mortise piece to sneak up on where I want the depth of each side of the tenon to be cut to. So I have to do each side individually, and unfortunately I'm not centered left to right across that board, so I'll have to be making slightly different adjustments on both sides of the tenon piece. I then use a bench chisel to clean up the walls of the mortise a little bit. There's just a little bit left behind on the sides, so I get those cleaned up for a better fit. As I cut the second tenon, you can see from a different angle how I use the mortise itself up against the side of the blade to set the depth that I want each side cut on the mortise for this one. Pocket holes might not be seen as traditional joinery, but I think more and more people are seeing the value in them beyond just used in plywood, though typically I only use them in plywood now. With more advanced joinery like mortises and tenons and dovetails, I think they have fewer uses unless you're using them correctly in the right applications, but I'm still going to present that as a viable solution to the people that are learning about wood joinery at the demonstration. Next, I'm going to cut some classic miters. I do have a crosscut sled for cutting 45-degree miters, but it's not really my favorite. Every time I use it again, I roll it back and forth just to make sure everything's set at the right angle, even though I use a digital angle check finder on the blade before I start cutting. Sometimes there seems to be a little bit of resistance, so I make sure the sled is clear before I start cutting wood. So for this demonstration, I'm going to have miter joints and splined miters as well, so I'm cutting a couple different ones. And this is one joint I won't have any that are not glued together because you can kind of see the whole joint from the outside. Clamping a single miter joint was a unique problem for me to overcome because normally I'd be clamping a box or a frame and I could use a strap clamp. Since I'm only doing one, I got a couple of these corner clamp aids and I stacked them up to give a nice 45-degree reference surface that I could clamp these to and get them lined up. Once they were dry, I continued to use those corner clamp braces as sort of a work surface to cut my splines into. I decided to go with the walnut as the spline option because the only 1/4 inch stock I had was ash, so I thought even though this is sapwood walnut, it would give a little bit more contrast. So I wanted to lay out my stop points and the outer edges of the two splines I'm going to cut in. And after I have the outer edges measured, I can go back with the marking knife after I lay the 1/4 inch stock that I'm going to use for the splines up next to the first mark that I made. And then I remeasured the sides because I decided to make them just a little bit deeper and more pronounced. I have used a spline jig for the table saw in the past, but the one I had made wasn't perfect, so I ended up tossing it. So if I'm going to hand cut splines, I usually use a 1/4 inch bench chisel to move out the extra waste after the sides are cut. And I really don't get much tear out as long as I take my time and I'm careful. Obviously the video is sped up, but I was doing this pretty slowly. After the spline is dried in place, I can go ahead and use my flush cut saw to trim that off and then reuse the rest of that piece to lay in and glue for the other spline. While the other spline dried, I laid out my table saw and grabbed a couple pieces of ash to do a tongue and groove joint. So I cut the grooves first, and then I would go back with the crosscut sled and use the crosscut sled to cut a tongue. At this point, I decided to take some time and get the joints I'd done so far glued together and start getting them dried so I could work with them later. Unfortunately, the footage was lost, but I did cut a rabbet joint. All I did was mark the width of one end of one of the boards on the other and used that same dado stack on my saw to clear out some of that material and fit that in the end so I could demonstrate a rabbet joint as well. No additional cutting was required for the butt joint, but I did measure on the edge the width of the board so that I could find the center of them and then make sure the screws are going into the center of the second board. And I'll be countersinking these screws, so what I might do is go back and actually plug one of the two holes with a dowel so that I could demonstrate both covering with the dowel and leaving them open, just so people can see what that joint looks like as well. Last but not least is hand-cut dovetails. So I started off, I'm going to do tails first, is how most people do it, so that's how I'm going to do it as well. Mark out how deep I want both to go, so I'm going to mark my tails piece and my pins piece on both sides so I can see how deep I need to go with the saw as I'm cutting. Next I'm going to mark where I want the ends of the tails to be. Now on a board this wide I didn't think it really mattered because I'm just going to have kind of a half a tail on each end and then one full tail in the middle. So as long as it looked the same from both ends, it really didn't matter how wide I cut them. And because I don't have a fancy workbench, I just clamped mine to the back fence of my crosscut sled and it worked just fine for me for now. I do want to build a nice Roubeau style workbench or something similar in the future, but I'm not really using hand tools quite enough at this point to make it worth my time, I don't think. After clearing most of my waste with a coping saw, I went back with the chisel and cleaned up as much as I could to get back down to the line. I took my time on this because I didn't want to take too much material off, but I wanted a nice, clean, accurate cut, so I really had to take my time. I didn't use the hammer too much. It was mostly just slowly chiseling slices away. After my tails were cleaned up, it was time to go lay that on top of the other piece and mark where I wanted my pins to be. So I clamped the tails to the top of the pins board. Again, I've seen other better ways of doing this, but this is the best I have for what I have to work with, and it ended up working just fine, as you'll see. Now at this point you'll see I made a pretty crucial error if you notice what it is. What I learned in this, and this is only my third attempt at ever hand cutting dovetails, and all 3 attempts were in the last couple days, I did not mark which sections were waste and which sections were the actual pins. So what I ended up doing is the 2 parts that were supposed to be the pins are what I cut out with the coping saw, and proceeded to spend quite a bit of time chiseling away the excess waste, and I did not, I left the parts that were where the dovetails will be. And at this point you can see this is where I noticed the error of my ways. Both my pins and tails occupy the same space, so it was back over to recut the pins. But after I got that sorted out, I was back over to the glue pad to glue up the dovetails that I finally completed and was pretty happy with. My box joints ended up not being quite as flush as I'd like them to be. I didn't take the extra time to make sure the jig was set just right. I should have cut them a little bit deeper at the time. But that's okay. I sanded down the surfaces with the oscillating belt sander in this case and got them back to flush. Now it was onto the orbital sander, where I spent the time sanding down every surface of every one of these joints, getting them ready for their final finish. And to finish all these pieces, I'm using a hard wax oil from General Finishing Systems, a small Canadian company. They're not sponsoring this video, but I'm pretty happy with their product. It's similar to other hard wax oils, but it's a little bit thicker, and I really like the consistency of it. And it has a citrusy smell to it, which I kind of enjoy. You know what I mean. And if you made it this far through all the boring sanding and finishing, you can see a quick montage of the final products all sanded, finished, ready to go. You can see some of the loose joints still able to pull apart so people can see how they work as well. If you enjoyed this video, found anything useful at all, got any tips, please do subscribe. It helps me immensely. And if you have any comments on any of the different joints, if you have any tips, techniques, please leave them in the comments below. I'd really appreciate that as well. And please like this video, and if anyone else you know that would benefit from this, please share it with them. Thanks for watching.